All right, wonderful. I'm going to get started then. Welcome. My name is Ashley Nelson, and I am the Director of Communications at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this member spotlight where we will be talking with Anna Edwards of Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, a site of conscience in Virginia. Excuse me. I'm sorry, there we go. Angie, can we just make sure we're recording this? I think we are, but I just want to make sure. Before turning to that vital site, for those of you joining us for the first time, let me quickly say that Sites of Conscience is the only global network of historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that connect past struggles to today's movements for human rights and social justice. Founded in 1999, we now have over 300 members in 65 countries, from Ellis Island in New York City to former centers of detainment in Argentina, to sites that remember and learn from the Atlantic slave trade in West Africa. We support these sites in a variety of ways, including grants, networking, joint programs, and training. For more information on how to engage or become a member, please visit our website at sitesofconscience.org. For today's discussion, we are centered in North America, where the histories that are covered up, forgotten, and sometimes literally buried say a lot more about the true state of injustice in the country today than those that are lauded. While the Atlantic slave trade brought 12.5 million Africans to the New World, for instance, America's capital lacks a single national monument to slavery. Sites of conscience in this region are notable for many reasons, but a primary one being that they consciously uncover these histories of injustice. To give one example, before it was a site of conscience, where the history of women's rights in America was shared, the chapel where Elizabeth Cady Stanton convened the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848 had been repurposed as a laundromat and a roller derby, among other uses. Similarly, our member today, Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, works to preserve the area of downtown Richmond, Virginia, known as Shackle Bottom. In the decades before the end of the US Civil War, the area was the epicenter of the US domestic slave trade and included over 100 sites associated with it. Here to tell us more about this sacred space and the current events to preserve it is Anna Edwards, who has been chair of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project of the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality since 2004, working to interpret, preserve, and expand understanding of the early African and African-American history of Shackle Bottom in Richmond, Virginia. The group's goal, in partnership with the Shackle Bottom Advocates Group, Preservation Virginia, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, is to change the public history landscape of Richmond by helping to establish a 9-acre Shackle Bottom Memorial Park footprint containing sites of the free and enslaved Black life in the 18th century, as well as the city's role as the epicenter of the domestic slave trade in the 19th century. Edwards' other research interests include the early history of American and African Atlantic world, historic preservation, land use, social justice, memory, and identity. Currently working at the American Civil War Museum, she has consulted on interpretive projects with the Valentine, curated an exhibit at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, and partnered with the Library of Virginia on Truth and Reconciliation in the 400th year of a public history symposium in 2019. Edwards holds a bachelor's degree in visual arts and a master's degree in history with an emphasis on public history. I'm so excited to welcome you, Anna. I'm going to hand the floor over to you, but before, I just want to remind our attendees that we have a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box at any time, or you can raise your hand and also ask your question at the end. But now I'm so honored to hand it over to you, Anna, to tell us more about Sacred Ground and the history it shares.
Thank you, Ashley, very much. And thank you everyone at Sites of Conscience, because you've all been really kind and thoughtful and intentional people to work with over these years. My work with the burial ground and the area that we refer to as the Shackle Bottom Memorial Park did begin in 2004. And what's really, for me, I like to talk about maybe what flipped my switch. I had come to Richmond in 1988, and I didn't know anything about Virginia, or much about the history on the ground, the experience of life in Virginia. And so one of the things that startled me the most when I got here, and I had been living in New York, and before that I lived in Los Angeles. So these are urban environments, and they're very much mixed racially, at least the areas where I grew up. Again, as a child, you know only your world. And so as an adult coming to Virginia, one of the things that really struck me was the segregated neighborhoods, not intentional, but clearly historically segregated neighborhoods. And the divisions were much starker. And because Virginia was not a place with a lot of populations from other countries and other peoples, it was very much a Black and white world. And it felt like I had a lot to learn. And so it wasn't until many years later, in the early 2000s, that I started to get involved with social justice activism in the city, and getting a real immersion in the struggles of people who are in prison, the reasons that people end up in prison, the reasons why prisons don't treat people very well, and the idea that there was this disconnect between sort of the historical and understanding of the historical causes for why people end up more repressed than others, in the environment that I was living in. I was raising my children, I was going to the store, and I'm living my what I think is my regular life, and yet I'm surrounded by and living amongst people who are having very different experience at exactly the same time. And so trying to understand why that might be was part of what motivated my interest. Specifically, the area in Shackle Bottom, and I think we can go to the next slide. There's a nice historic map. Is that, well, okay, so this was me being clever with my montage here. So what you have at the base is a historic map of Richmond from the 1860s. And it is upside down, and that's because that map was oriented properly, whereas this photograph was taken looking from north to south. So this is intended to show where I'm acting like I can point at things. But where you see the highway moving through this photograph from the bottom right to the top left is Interstate 95, and in the upper left area, it's crossing the James River. And so in the map, you sort of see that the river is in the upper area of the map, and below is the city grid. And we do that, it's a way to sort of articulate, the changes in the landscape, and to show you literally the area. So the green space that you see in the photograph is the area of the African burial ground, which is at the center of the memorial park that we're trying to preserve. The rest of the area goes sort of upward in the photograph and looks like a parking lot. And then it goes off across the railroad tracks to the left and through the parking lot areas there to the left as well. So that's the area that we're specifically talking about. And primarily, I think it's because, one, the discovery of the African burial ground by a scholar in the late 1990s, Elizabeth Camborian, it really helped us see that, for one thing, it was an invisible landscape. It was not a place you could see. Before the green space, which occurred in 2011, it was also parking. And that is a way of, sort of showing the fact that this was not an area that was valued for any particular cultural resources for, really pretty much ever since it had been a burial ground. So this had become an invisible site. And yet in the late 90s, this historian had been doing research on the story of Gabriel's Rebellion and found that the landscape of that rebellion, which took place in 1800, was the landscape of her childhood. And so she had a personal connection, again, growing up running around the spaces where the plantation had been that Gabriel had grown up on, had been trained to be a blacksmith and worked on, and he, but also the landscape where the planning for the rebellion took place, and the many sites throughout, from the northern part of the city right down into the city of Richmond, where these events took place. And when I say rebellion, I actually mean the planning and organizing of the rebellion, because in fact it didn't come off because there was a storm and there was betrayal. And so the event itself didn't happen. Its planning, however, was significant to talking about the early era of the brand new nation, because Gabriel was born in 1776 and died in 1800. And so he lived literally his life in the first quarter century of the existence of the United States. And he lived literally within the context of the rhetoric for freedom and the equal rights of humanity, and separation from tyranny and repression and all this good stuff, and a period in which there had been some hope for enslaved people that slavery might, by logical extension, be planned, to no longer exist. But within his lifetime, those hopes were also dashed. And so then we look at the need that he and others felt compelled to organize a rebellion. But again, part of what this, as I am talking about that, and as I am talking about that history and its significance, just to understand it all and to know about it all, there is for the people of Richmond the fact that these events took place here, and that the episode of Gabriel's rebellion and that attempt to end slavery precedes the period in which the domestic slave trade rises to become the dominant trade in the country in the 19th century, and in the period in which Richmond itself becomes, over a 30-year period, sort of rises to become the epicenter of that domestic trade. And one of the reasons for that is that Virginia has the largest enslaved population by the time we get to this. Well, I'm sorry, actually early on and through this period. And so, so the numbers of people mean that the trade is robust, and it certainly is. And one of the sort of telling stories that sort of helps to emphasize that is that at the end of the Civil War, when the United States troops arrived into the city of Richmond, literally to help put out the fires that had been started by the Confederacy's evacuating forces, but also to break people out of the slave jails, and basically to liberate the city from from control by the Confederacy. The soldiers, the United States colored troops who came in to liberate that city, literally were reuniting with family members who still lived in Richmond, even though many of them had been sold away as children 20 years before. And so this is something that is remarked upon by several people writing letters from the period. The particular person, Captain Garland White, was a chaplain in the colored troops that came in and served as an officer, which was unusual as well. So, it's pretty much not any story that I could start to tell you about this area in Shackle Bottom that doesn't resonate in many ways with issues of certainly human rights, but then specifically the story, the journey of the story of slavery and the ending of slavery in the United States. And so this is recognized. It's important to understand that many people over the years have worked on this kind of reclamation of the history, reclamation of physical sites in the city and the area, and we followed in the footsteps of people who have done that work. Our particular goal was to focus attention on the burial ground, and then as we were doing that, we ended up having to face the fact that this was a highly desirable area for development, and we had to organize to fight against several iterations of baseball stadium and luxury condominium development in the area, immediately adjacent to it, surrounding it. And so in the course of doing that, we really began to help people understand that there was a lot more at stake than any one aspect of the struggle to preserve this site. And one was, of course, the history was so important. We needed this space to be able to tell the story. But the first line of really defense and offense was this was a cemetery. This was a burying ground for the poor of Richmond, for the enslaved of Richmond, free and, for Black people in Richmond, both free and enslaved. And it was the first such cemetery site designated for that purpose in the city in 1799. And it was in use until 1816. And then when that closed, and that was closed in part due to the petition of the free Black community, that it was an untenable site because of its adjacency to Shackle Creek and the fact that the creek would flood regularly. And so it was unstable, and it was known that bodies would wash out. So they were given another site a little further north and a little bit on higher ground that wasn't quite so subject to those conditions. And that cemetery, the Shackle Hill African Burial Ground, grew from 2 acres to 31 acres and existed for 80 years over the course of the 19th century. So by telling that, we're also describing a continuity of a landscape as well. So we start in the 18th century with this site, this African burial ground, and then its relationship to the slave trade as it grew in that area. And then also the ways in which cemeteries become a part of Black life in Richmond, and the specific histories of each of these cemeteries and how they contribute to that understanding. So it's been quite a journey. And no, I'm sorry, that's black and white. That should have been color. But what you're looking at here is the solution that we worked with the community to propose for the preservation of the area. And that was one to articulate exactly where the 9 acres that we were trying to describe that needed to be preserved, to identify and secure that those properties. And what that ended up meaning was that the city would take control of them from a private owner. And so that was done in 2011. The burial ground was purchased by the city and became a part of their holdings. And then in 2015 through 2017, we worked with the community and with partners like Preservation Virginia and, excuse me, the National Trust for Historic Preservation to develop the processes by which we would create a proposal to submit to the city for how this area could be preserved and developed. And so what you're looking at, this image is one of the planning documents, and there are lots of little circles all over it, which each identify various aspects of the footprint that would be turned into what we were broadly calling a memorial park, but which actually contains several different sort of principles of engagement. So the burial ground area would be the area for commemoration and reverence and honoring our ancestors. The southern area, or you can see that there's a highway or a roadway dividing the area. So south of that road, which is Broad Street, is the area where the Lumpkins slave jail site is, the archaeological site. There was significant work done there that demonstrated very clearly the scope of one trader's operation, which then itself helped us understand the scope of many other operations in the area. And so that area is designated specifically for active learning and for active engagement with the resources that have been sort of opened up for actual physical interaction. And then a little to the right in this image, again to the right of the railroad tracks, we wanted to secure what we could of the area that still contained archaeological potential, sites that had existed there that were actively involved in slave trading during that period. So that part is designated as kind of, I like to call it the front porch. It's the gathering spot. It's I think in the document it's actually referred to as oh no, I've drawn a blank. That's terrible. My own document. Anyway, it's like the gathering spot, and so it's designed to be the place where the public can, from and everywhere else in Shackle Bottom, can see that there is a place to go to, because that's another aspect of this whole site. One of the things that you might have noticed in these images is that the area I'm describing is on the one hand bounded by Interstate 95, which is elevated, and by railroad tracks, which are also elevated. So at street level, you can't see this site at all. It has absolutely no visible presence. So having a front porch, having a gateway, a way in, and a way that integrates it with the surrounding district is incredibly important to this site. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I feel like I have so many questions. And again, I want to remind attendees that they can put questions in the Q&A box or raise their hand. I know I would love to hear a little bit more. I mean, the site remembers in part a rebellion, Gabriel's rebellion, but it's also really the work of so many activists. And I would love to just hear, you know, so many of our sites of conscience, they are here because of everyday activists. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about that and that process, and particularly around the question of land and who has access to land and gaining that. Can you say a few things about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, because yeah, from the beginning, it was all about what the community didn't know about this area, and from the beginning, we realized that, well, it came out of our social justice work, right? It came out of the idea that you know, there were these systemic problems that are affecting present day life, and here we have this cultural resource that told the story of this amazing hero to the Black community that they didn't really know about, or because his story had been told as if he had failed, they didn't get to pull off the rebellion for these reasons, without talking about the incredible impact that it had had on the city and on policy making going forward. And so to actually have the physical space from which to be able to tell that story, because he had died on the site of his burial ground. The trials had taken place nearby in a courthouse that had existed not too far away. The jail or the prison that had been built was not too far away where he was held. And so as we began to tell the story of the burial ground, we realized that it was very much a social justice campaign. And so immediately there were certain mechanisms that happened to work out to get started. One was a radio program, and the other was a newspaper. The newspaper continues to this day. But the other more important event, I think, in terms of really engaging with people who had done work, like historians and scholars who had already done work, it just wasn't widely known, was to bring it straight to the community. And one of the ways to do that was to engage the land directly, and that was by holding annual events. And so we picked October 10th as a day of memory for that's the day that Gabriel died. But it was also, and because he died on the burial ground, we could connect these two ideas of the aspirations of Gabriel and his fellows, and the work literally to save this site. And initially it was, again, to get the asphalt removed, was to get it, saved from being a parking lot. And so you can see from these images here, we have this wonderful "Get Your Asphalt Off My Ancestors." There was a woman working with us at that time. Her name is Free Bangura, and she continues to do work with language and with what she calls tactical urbanism in the area to activate sites on a temporary basis, but sort of a ritual-oriented basis as well. The people say no stadium in Shackle Bottom. The National Trust helped provide these signs to say save Shackle and protect sacred ground. We did programs about different issues. So this yellow flyer represented a struggle that we were engaged with people who were working for $15 an hour, right? So the impact of slavery is about labor provided to produce goods, and the history of labor continues, into emancipation, into the present day struggle for workers for their own rights and for decent living. So it was easy to connect these things, and it was easy in that way to also partner with people who were doing different aspects of that struggle. Yeah, so it's been a very powerful shared experience.
That's great. And you know, you are part of a new project at Sites of Conscience called Transitional Justice in America that supports really small community projects designed to address truth, justice, and reconciliation questions in America. And I mean, I'm curious to hear, you know, what you feel Sites of Conscience can do to support those sorts of processes and those conversations. Um, how can they highlight this? How can communities engage?
Yeah. In so many communities and projects and efforts, I think now are kind of intrinsically engaging this idea of being sites of conscience, right? They're reminders of things that have happened. And um, we, I was really fortunate, I think, or we were really fortunate that through being recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Preservation Virginia, both of whom had been actively engaged with or partnered with in various ways this international coalition of sites of conscience. And so they introduced me to it, and I had a conversation with Braden and a couple other people, and we decided to join. And it was really very clear. It was really kind of a no-brainer. It was like everything that we talk about that this site represents or intersects with is about the work that the Sites of Conscience was intended to do. And to be connected to a global network of those kind of sites really spoke to people. So when we raised that here, it seems very natural to people that the site here in Richmond would be a part of that dynamic. And so, putting Sites of Conscience, on our material or including it in our presentations, and not just to promote the organization, but to promote the idea. It works. It works very well. And so I'm really pleased that I was invited to be a site participating in this project, Transitional Justice in the U.S., because in many ways the United States tends to think of itself as the center of the universe, and that we're the ones with stuff to teach the rest of the world, when in fact we have huge amount to learn from our partners who are going through who are continuing to go through challenges that are creating new sites of conscience, basically. And as people in the United States are finding and unveiling, revealing, bringing to light more sites like this that speak to our history of involvement with crimes against humanity, it's really it's very meaningful to be able to listen and learn and see what we can apply from those experiences here as more and more sites get revealed.
Well, we're so honored and excited by this project and that you're a part of that project, and then hopefully, in the years ahead, we can continue to build this movement, particularly in, I think, North America, which really needs to address these issues. So on the screen now, we encourage you to visit sacredgroundproject.net, where you can learn more about the project and how you can help and engage. I have also put a survey in the chat box. It really helps us do our future programming, and it helps us to hear what works and doesn't work from you. So please, if you have a moment, fill that out. And please continue to visit our social media, where you can hear updates about projects like Sacred Ground and others. And also you can look into our upcoming webinars. The next one is on August 4th, and we'll focus on digital dialogues. So thank you so much, Anna. It's been lovely to sort of have you here. Thank you for all of your insights, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone. Thank you.